22 of IHA's Connect FALL 2022. I'm Peter Gianetti with Homepage News, and this session is PFAS chemicals and housewares, answering the critical questions. IHA and the Cookware and Bakeware Alliance are continuing a partnership to inform the housewares industry about legislation regulating products made with PFAS chemicals. It's an issue once thought that to affect only certain nonstick coated cookware and bakeware products, but it's actually impacting a wide range of housewares products that come in contact with food. The latest installment of this joint educational program by IHA and CBA will provide important updates on enacted and proposed state laws covering products made with PFAS chemicals. Our panelists will also allocate extra time today during the special Connect Fall presentation to answer the many questions being asked by industry decision makers about how to prepare for PFAS regulation. We did ask some people to submit questions ahead of time if you were registered to attend today. If you didn't, no problem. You can still submit questions during the session using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll get to as many questions as time permits. I am pleased to introduce our panelists today. We have Fran Grossbeck, who's the Managing Director of the Cookware and Bakeware Alliance. Tobias Gerfen, who's the CEO of Kuhn Rikon and President of the European Association for Cookware, Cutlery, and Flatware. And Tom Lee, who's a partner in the Energy, Environment, and Infrastructure Practice Group at the law firm of Bryan, Cave, Layton, and Paisner. The bios of our panelists are available on the Connect Fall page at the housewares.org website. Check it out if you'd like to see a little bit more about our panelists. A note that these sessions are being recorded and will be available soon on IHA's website. Welcome, Fran, Tobias, and Tom. Fran, let's get started with you for an important update on PFAS and what's going on with that.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to share my screen here. Can you all see that? Wonderful. So PFAS legislation is an important and growing issue and is no longer focused on nonstick cookware alone. In fact, it's no longer about just cookware anymore. And please note that all information shared here is not legal advice, and any actions that you take should be confirmed with your legal teams. Before we jump into PFAS, I would just like to take this opportunity to update those joining us today on the CBA, formerly the Cookware Manufacturers Association. As Peter mentioned, we're now the Cookware and Bakeware Alliance. Honoring our 100-year history, this new name reflects the incredible markets we represent, and we are growing and evolving to include all in our industry. Our latest membership level, the Industry Relations membership, invites retailers to be part of what we do, setting standards, creating powerful connections inside our markets and with strategic partners, and of course, solutions to topics facing our industry, such as what we're here to talk about today, are some of the powerful benefits of being a part of the CBA. The CBA continues to look for and work with partner companies that can help our members manage the legislation requirements, some of which are on this panel today and referenced in the upcoming slides. And the following slides will give you just a very high-level overview of PFAS and the legislations, where it all stands, before Tom gets into the legislation. And just know this is a very fast-moving and ever-changing issue, so staying connected is really important. So what is PFAS? PFAS is a group of chemicals that, when used, their intention is to enhance or achieve a certain outcome with the betterment of that product and or situation in mind. In the US, we quote that there are over 5,000 chemicals in this family, but there are only about 600 of them in commerce within that group. And this is important to remember, and we'll come back to that point shortly. This large family of chemicals do not all look the same. There are different groups. Each group has different characteristics that further define them. And then there are key risk factors to be considered as well. And again, not all are used in commerce, but the first steps in classifying and understanding PFAS include fluorochemicals versus fluoropolymers, short chains versus long chains, non-polymeric versus polymeric, water soluble versus non-water soluble. And these are just some of the distinctions, and some of those distinctions separate them and then out into substances of concern and substances not of concern. Then you have to look at the three key risk factors of mobility, toxicity, and persistence. Having said all that, understanding each individual chemical's rank on the risk factors, and then looking at all the other components, identify the individual chemicals risk profile. This is what some agencies such as ECHA in Europe and the EPA here in the US are trying to study and understand better. It's through this science that we'll better understand these chemistries, and time is needed to do so. This is just a snapshot of the complexity of understanding PFAS. And one simple note that we've come to help us in understanding this is because we hear this topic of the forever chemicals, and the forever chemical studies are regarding the fluorochemicals we mentioned just a few seconds ago, fluorochemicals versus fluoropolymers. Just keep that distinction in mind. We are continuing to make education documents to help understand these different topics. There are two types of legislation we're dealing with right now: right to know laws, and the others defining outright bans of PFAS. The right to know laws are good approaches to this complex topic. While AB 1200 in California and Colorado HB 1345 have some questions surrounding how to meet the requirements, which is why we're here today, the overall goal is a good one, giving consumers the right to know what is in their products. The legislation that looks to ban or prohibit PFAS as a whole is concerning, as it could lead to regrettable substitutions and unintended consequences. In both types of legislation, the definition of cookware is not just about nonstick cookware, even just about cookware. As you see here on the top, extracted from California's AB 1200, cookware is defined as any product that is used to prepare, dispense, or store food, foodstuffs, or beverages. Newer legislation is going one step further to simply state products, and this excerpt on the bottom is from Minnesota, which describes any consumer product, including its components. Minnesota, by the way, is proposed, California is enacted, and Tom will talk more about those. AB 1200 in California and Colorado's HB 1345 are right to know laws, and both were enacted. They both have specific deadlines for labeling and claims to be updated. The labeling will be required on the packaging as well as on the webpage at different dates and different stages. And there are marketing claims that are now strictly prohibited. The use of the word free, for example, PFOA or PFAS free in marketing claims is no longer allowed under these laws. The other legislation, such as Maine's 38 MRSA 1641, which is one of the proposed, Maine's passed on January 1st, 2023, it will require manufacturers of products that contain intentionally added PFAS to provide written notification to the Maine DEP, providing information on that product and PFAS content. On January 1st, 2030, these products cannot be sold unless the Maine DEP has determined the use of PFAS in the product is currently unavoidable. The other legislations proposing full bans have not been enacted yet, and some have stalled in chamber, and some include other products as well as cookware. Those legislations could be dangerous and have broader impact on industries such as electronics, automotive, and energy. Cell phone, laptops, electric vehicles, 5G networks, and alternate energies, to name a few, rely on PFAS chemicals to work. So the message we want to get out there is get educated on PFAS, learn where it's used in your products and your manufacturing processes. If your product comes in contact with food, you're part of this. Develop tools to address internal and consumer questions. Begin planning for the requirements, some of which are right around the corner, January 1st, 23. Remember, it is beyond cookware now. Find out if your products fall in these legislations and get connected. The complete product cycle is impacted in some of these laws, including where PFAS is intentionally used in the manufacturing process. So it does not only cover, and it goes from manufacturing now to the marketing, as we said, they now cover that free or free from is no longer an acceptable term in promoting any product. And do something rather than nothing. Get started, do your research, ask questions, plan packaging and product changes where necessary. Connect with all your resources and get your documentation ready. Both legislators and consumers will be more understanding of a company who has made an effort to address these laws, an important issue. I'm going to take just one last minute to say that our engineering standard is spearheading all of the education documents that we're doing. Here you see some of our industry news. We have one for every legislation out there. We also have resources in the back of these. We have partnered with the FEC to make videos on PFAS education. Tom Lee and BCLP have been instrumental in helping us stay on top of this state by state, what's going on. And I just want to do a big shout out to our members who give me their time and resources and to create these tools. And what we've done and what we're working on PFAS is only beginning. And we are so grateful to the IHA who let us come here today. We're not the experts of the chemistry, but we are the experts in these product categories. And we want to make sure we stay ahead of this legislation with all these avenues. So if you want to be part of the solution, we invite you to join us, and we are stronger together facing this or any issue.
Thank you, Fran. I'm now going to turn it over to Tom Lee, who's going to give us an update on the state legislation involving PFAS chemicals. Tom, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Fran. So nice to get that framing and also the call to action at the end, because it is a critically important issue for a number of industries, including housewares. So I'm really glad we're having this conversation. So my presentation will take you through some of the specific state laws that have been enacted and how those impacts the industry. Apologize. You know, Peter, I'm sorry. It might make sense for you to share my slides if you don't mind.
Okay.
If you have them up. While I pulling them up. So Fran's framing is absolutely right. There are sort of two broad categories of regulations out there. Ones that provide some kind of consumer right to know, typically through website notices and labeling, and others that have absolute prohibitions on the presence, typically of intentionally added PFAS. And that is a very specific concept. Most of the laws have the same or similar language, but that's something you'll hear me discuss as we go through this. There have been a lot of questions around this, so something that we'll spend a little time talking about. So here you can see the breakdown of states that have proposed and enacted either right to know laws or outright bans. Just to give you a sense for how much this has changed over the last few years, I don't know if you noticed, but in Fran's slides, there was another map of the US that we provided, I want to say 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, and there were only 2 or 3 states that were showing up on the map. So this is a very rapidly evolving regulatory space. So we can go to the next slide. You can see the list of states that have actually enacted or proposed different types of regulations. And interestingly, there are more proposed bans of PFAS substances than there are proposed right to know laws. Now, as Fran correctly noted, a lot of those don't make it out of committee or out of the assemblies. So, you know, they don't have a 100% success rate, but it is interesting to note that there is more of a trend towards regulating for bans versus right to know laws. So we'll start going through some of the specifics here. Colorado's HB 1345 is a very interesting bill in that it's quite comprehensive. So with respect to cookware, it is a right to know law. And by January 1st, 2024, manufacturers must provide a label on the product that identifies any intentionally added PFAS substances. And there's also a corollary requirement that you post that on your website as well. And there's some details here about what that warning should actually look like. But what I think is really interesting and important is HB 135 actually does have a absolute use prohibition as well for certain categories of products. And I think the category that is potentially relevant here is for juvenile products. So starting in January 2024, you cannot sell in Colorado any juvenile products that contain intentionally added PFAS. So it's something to really focus on if you have any products that are marketed towards anyone under 12 years old. And this comes up in California as well. The definition of PFAS in Colorado's law is what we typically see. And it's interesting that it is a little broader, I think, than what some regulatory agencies are moving towards. So this definition is any fluorinated organic chemicals that contain at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. So I will be the first to admit I am not the scientist on the line here, but the way that scientists explain this one to me is this is essentially everything, you know, all the different branches of the broad PFAS family tree. But what's really important is that there are functional and technical distinctions within that family tree. So I think one of the avenues that industry is exploring is ways to try to steer legislation towards a more practical and health-based definition of what PFAS is. And again, just to reinforce Fran's point, cookware is not just limited to, you know, pots and pans. It includes any durable houseware product that is used in residences or kitchens to prepare, dispense, or store food or beverages. So it is a broad net of products. There is a limited exemption, but we won't spend too much time on that. It's essentially if your product is so incredibly small that you do not have room to put a label on it, you are not required to put a label on it, but it's a pretty narrow exemption. So California AB 1200 is very similar, but one of the key distinctions between the Colorado law and the California law that I want to highlight right up front is the Colorado law is targeted at PFAS chemicals. It is a PFAS right to know or ban law. California AB 1200 is not limited to PFAS. It pulls from a very broad regulatory list. It includes everything that's listed under Prop 65, all the DTSC candidate chemicals for their Safer Consumer Products Program, and a number of other regulatory lists. So that's the really important distinction between Colorado and AB 1200 is the scope of chemicals that fall under the notice requirements. As I think everybody knows at this point, by January 1st, 2023, your website and the product-specific website for any products that meet these criteria needs to list all intentionally added designated chemicals.
This slide notes 2024. Should it say 2023?
Well, so there's two requirements. There's
Okay.
the website requirement, which is the preceding slide.
Right. Oh, okay.
And then by January, well, it's a really good distinction because I think people are more focused on this date. This is the date when you need that information on your label. And so that's the date a lot of people have in their heads, but the January 1st, 2023 date is the deadline for putting it on your website. You also, by January 1st, 2023, cannot make any claims on your website about a product being PFAS free if it contains any intentionally added PFAS. So, you know, AB 1200 is, it's very important. There are some really key upcoming deadlines. So just want to, I know there's been a lot of discussion on it, but I want to really focus people in on what the requirements are there. So AB 652 is the California prohibition on regulated PFAS in juvenile products. And interestingly, the list of example products that is included in the statute, you see a summary here. It's more, you know, juvenile furniture, accessories, pads, car seats, those sort of, at least what I don't typically think of as housewares, but it is not an exhaustive list. What the regulation actually says is juvenile products includes any product designed for use by infants and children under 12 years of age, including this list of examples. So, you know, we don't have we don't have a lot of clarification on this point yet, but based on the statutory language, it looks like the intent here is to include products that are marketed towards anyone under 12 years old, which could certainly include, you know, cookware, you know, sippy cups, any type of house goods that are marketed towards children. And this is an actual prohibition. So as of July 1st, 2023, you're not allowed to include those compounds or sell those products in California. Interestingly, so any violations are a misdemeanor and punishable by a fine of $50 to $1,000 or up to 6 months of imprisonment. Through civil penalties, they're making them enforced as a misdemeanor. So the other California law that I wanted to highlight, because I think it's not on everyone's radar, and it really should be, and there's a lot of focus on AB 1200, but SB 343 is also really important. So this is the recycling law that was recently passed. And it has a lot of material in it, covers a lot of different issues, but for our purposes, it says that a plastic product is not recyclable. You cannot make a recyclability claim if it's made from plastic or fiber that contains PFAS that is either intentionally added or at concentrations at or above 100 parts per million as measured in total organic fluorine. I will not bore you all with the technical discussion on the issues with the total organic fluorine test, but note that it is not an accurate measure of PFAS concentration. It is very over-inclusive. So when you see that 100 ppm limit, it's functionally, you're being held to a more stringent standard if you're just talking about pure PFAS. But it's an important point. So this applies to products and packaging. You cannot make a recyclability claim if either of those things include intentionally added PFAS or total organic fluorine above 100 parts per million. So another important packaging labeling issue that needs to be accounted for. Maine's law has been around a little bit longer, so I won't spend as much time on it, but you know, as Fran mentioned, by January 1st, 2023, manufacturers of products that contain intentionally added PFAS need to provide written notice to the DEP providing information on the product, the PFAS content. I know that a number of companies are running up against that deadline and have some concerns about their ability to meet it. So I think if anyone in the industry feels that they might need an extension of time to respond, better to start those conversations sooner rather than later. Because you know that deadline is coming up, and as Fran said, regulators will always respond better if you are proactive rather than reactive. So the hammer in Maine's law is by January 1st, 2030, you may not sell or distribute any product, including cookware, bakeware, houseware, that contains intentionally added PFAS, unless the DEP has determined that the use of PFAS in your product is a currently unavoidable use. So there is an exemption. You could try to work with DEP to establish that there is no way to replace the PFAS that is in your product. I think the general expectation is that that will be a very difficult argument to make by January 1st, 2030. And there's no guarantee that Maine will agree with industry arguments on those points. So, you know, that it's important to note that there is a potential exemption here. But its applicability seems like it may be fairly limited. And then I'll just quickly mention that Washington has already enacted some regulations related to PFAS and consumer products. We expect more on the cookware front. They've identified cookware in their most recent installment of the Safer Products for Washington initiative. So it's something that's very much in their regulatory focus. We just haven't seen what their specific action will look like. So that's a very quick overview of the regulations that have been actually enacted. The following slides, which I won't speak to now, but will be, I believe, shared afterwards, provide a little background on the proposed regulations in this space. So if you want to take a look at what's out there in the administrative world for discussion, this gives you a summary, and there are some links towards the end as well. So I think really just to reiterate some of the great points that Fran made, this is a complicated issue at every level. It's complicated for legislators, it's complicated for industry, and it's something that's going to take time for people to understand. I mean, to identify the presence of PFAS in your upstream supply chain, in your manufacturing process, and those are two very different and equally important things. It takes time and a lot of partnership with your internal teams and with your vendors. So, if you're looking at a January 2023 compliance date, this is something that, really needs to be front of mind, something that people are working on to figure out. So I'll turn it over to Peter and look forward to answering some questions a little bit.
Thank you, Tom. And yes, we will, just a note to everyone, there's a lot of information on these slides. In addition to the recordings that are going to be available on housewares.org, on the Connect FALL page on housewares.org, hopefully by the beginning of next month, end of this month. Homepage News is doing reports on each of the Connect FALL sessions, and we can include links to these presentations in those reports. So be patient. Those should be up in the next day or so as well, too. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Tobias, who can give us an update on PFAS developments as they are affecting European industry right now.
Thank you, Peter. Europe is a little bit easier than the US at the moment because the regulation is in a sleeping mode. They're on the way to write the PFAS standard or regulation. The first draft will be published in January. Then there will be a 30-day timing to give feedback on it. So I invite everybody to have a look, and if you think it's valuable to give a feedback also from the US, that's a good thing. And then it goes into the usual regulatory process in Europe. So we expect really to have a final version 6 to 12 months after. But at this moment, and we don't have a final version of our first draft. However, the moment this is done, I expect to see impact on bills in the States, in the United States, because they will look at what Europe is proposing. So I wouldn't be surprised if the long list that Fran and Tom have shown, that this list will become active on bans if the draft proposes to ban PFAS in cookware. But otherwise, at the moment, we cannot say more. The last 2 months have been a lot of communication, but nothing legally relevant.
Thanks, Tobias. Well, we have a lot of questions, and what we wanted to do in this session was give more time to answer some of these questions. So we're going to get to as many as we can in the next half hour. Be patient with us. If there are any other questions as you think of as we're talking, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A session. Let's start with some questions from our that we got when we asked people to submit questions heading into this. The first question was, I think, Tom, you addressed some of this, are items that are defined as cookware by California AB 1200 and Colorado HB 22-1345, but marketed for children age 3 and over, such as reusable water bottles, lunch bags, bakeware, cookware sets, and the like. Are they within the scope of what is covered by those laws right now?
Yeah, so we did talk about this a little bit. I mean, the California law is a little bit clearer. It says juvenile products include products that are marketed towards children 12 and under, and then provides a list of examples. The Colorado law is not as clear. It says juvenile products means product designed for use by infants or children over 12 years of age, and includes a certain list. So it's product designed for use versus product marketed for use, a little different. But, you know, I think conservatively, juvenile products should be interpreted broadly under both laws. And, you know, unfortunately, it is a complete ban on the presence of PFAS in those products. So, you know, it's something that people really do need to focus on very seriously very soon, especially since the California law is already effective. I mean, Fran, I don't know if there's, or Tobias, sort of an industry perspective on the, you know, the risk of those types of chemicals being present in children's products, and how that should be interpreted. But I think from a regulatory standpoint, you know, we would say, yes, those types of products do fall under those laws.
I don't know anything specific, Tom, regarding juvenile products, but I think I default to the same sentence. Better to do something, better default on the side of safety and make sure that you have it. It's also, keep in mind, this is not just about the regulators. This is about the consumers that are watching and following this. So if you're not even addressing it or having some kind of position statement, making some kind of effort on these laws and letting the consumers know about it, it has another potential impact on you. So I just think it's better to always default on the side of safety and comply with the laws if you think that the statements cover you.
I will also maybe just quickly add that there is a litigation component to all this, and a risk that we haven't really talked about here. We've talked about the regulatory restrictions and limitations, but we are seeing pretty significant PFAS litigation. It's showing up in a lot of different ways. One is false advertising claims. So if you make a claim in your packaging that your products are safe, that they're, I've seen organic being challenged in the PFAS context. Any of those types of, you know, sort of health value statements, and your product is shown to contain PFAS, there are plaintiffs that are bringing false advertising, false claims based on that. We have seen some personal injury claims as well. Those are not as well defined because there isn't as clear a causal link between exposure to the compounds and identifiable illnesses. That's coming. You know, there is a whole plaintiffs bar out there that's working very hard on that link. So I think in addition to the regulatory risk, it's also important to keep in mind the potential litigation risk from, you know, the continued use of certain compounds in your products, particularly juvenile products.
Tom, I think you bring up an important point, and correct me if I'm wrong, but on AB 1200, everyone's focused a little bit on the website and the labeling coming in 24. But the requirement in AB 1200 about you cannot use the word free anymore, that's 2023.
On your website, yes,
right. You
absolutely.
Have to take that
Website's
off.
2023.
But making the claim of making the claim of PFOA free or PFAS free has to change now. Has to change in 2023, both and on your packaging. You can't make that marketing claim anywhere.
Yes,
I thought that was
right. That you cannot say PFOA anything with free or no. All these things have to go.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also not that if you have one type of PFAS, whatever the PFAS definition is, you cannot say PTFE is a different PFAS. So it's the complete group that is banned. And so if you have one of the 5,000-10,000 PFAS in your product, you cannot claim any more no or free. And it has to go on January 1st, 2023. And I would like to add one thing. We're talking a lot about the consumer. You have to keep also the retailer in mind. The question will be, when will the retailers no longer accept products that still have this labeling? It might be that they will be very early and say, okay, we start already in November, or we start in October with that. So the earlier you start taking that off your packaging, the better.
There is a question about essential use versus non-essential use when it comes to PFAS regulation as it pertains to the housewares industry. Is there a good argument that the intentional use of PFAS can be essential in housewares?
That is a very difficult discussion. We have it a lot in Europe because the strict and clear definition of essential use would ban more or less everything. And the regulators have already realized that. In Europe, we work very strongly to move from essential use to safe use. If something is safe, it should be allowed to be used. But this is up to the regulator finally to decide. When they are really using the essential use concept, a lot of applications, and unfortunately cookware is probably one of them, they will go, because they will say there are possibilities to get around PFAS.
There's another question about intentionally added substances, while in some state laws, while others just refer to substances. Technically, it is nearly impossible to state zero. Are there any quote unquote safe harbor levels which could be interpreted as zero? And on the side of intentionally added, how many stages in the supply chain need to be checked for this? Anyone?
Well, number one, I think Tom touched on that one.
Right.
With the new regulation, it says it doesn't matter when a substance was in the production process. The moment it is in the production process, it is part of it. So you cannot say, well, it's not in our final product. So getting away with it is my supplier of the supplier is no longer valid. And unfortunately, to my best knowledge, I hope Tom can correct me on that one, I have not seen any limit. So that would mean the limit is zero, which is impossible. But that is my reading. I hope that Tom can prove me wrong on that one.
I would love to if I could, but I cannot. No, it really is. I mean, the definition, it is limited in that it's something you're adding for a specific purpose. You know, it has some intended effect on either the manufacturing process or the product itself. But practically speaking, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that anything you're adding to your product doesn't have some intended purpose. I mean, even for example, if you're making a metal cookware product, the inert metals are being added for structural stability, for, you know, the physical characteristics of the product. So it's very hard to say that anything you're adding is not intentional. Now, the one caveat to that is, so I agree with Tobias. There is no, if you are adding it to something intentionally, there is no safe harbor. It needs to either be identified in your labels or under the laws that prohibit continued use needs to be removed. The only sort of nuance there is for some laws, regulated PFAS is either intentionally added or this value of 100 parts per million or more of total organic fluorine. And that second category is to capture any unintended PFAS that has been added. So in some regulations, there's two layers. There's, you know, you have to think about your intentionally added components, but also what may be unintentionally there, may be background. And that, to me, pulls in more your manufacturing process. So that's things like, you know, if you send ingredients through lines that are coated with a fluorinated substance, which is pretty common, the product moving through those lines may pick up some PFAS contamination. That is not intentional. You know, you're not intentionally adding that to the product. But if it creates a 100 parts per million or more total organic fluorine hit, then it is still regulated. So there's sort of two components you need to think about there. But unfortunately, no safe harbors like you might find under Prop 65 or some other regulatory structures.
Staying within the supply chain and manufacturing, one of our attendees is asking what Housewares brands can do to ensure that the supply chains are fundamentally in compliance and not significantly contributing to PFAS pollution, which I presume is the groundwater concerns, particularly during manufacturing and end of life stages. What can we do to audit the supply chain? Anyone?
That's what everyone has to be doing right now is engaging with their suppliers and identifying, and Tom used the word, the upstream, right? Literally every component, every step of the process, no stone unturned, speak to all of them, engage them, make sure they're doing their diligence to connect with any of their suppliers. It's literally a whole process. There are companies out there assisting with this chemical management kind of chain program. One of the partners we're working with right now is doing that because it is complex, but it's literally, it's not on someone, it's on everyone from retailers to brand owners should be asking, and then even the manufacturers, all their suppliers, and asking them to do their due diligence on this research.
We also recommend that people take a look at their contract. Sorry, Peter, just
that's good. Go ahead.
Completely agree with what Fran said. It's a complicated conversation. It's a potentially uncomfortable conversation for certain upstream vendors. At this point, everyone should have been asked about PFAS in some context. Everybody should be aware that this is a developing issue, but it is not always easy for upstream vendors to certify that they are not using it. So it's something you need to start now, but also take a look at your purchase agreements and see whether any risk associated with them getting those answers wrong is something that you hold or they hold. And obviously there are a lot of market dynamics there. It sort of depends where you are in the supply chain, but understanding how your contracts allocate risk for PFAS and these other regulated chemicals is really, really important. And it's something that is changing right now. So there is sort of a lot of discussion around it in these types of vendor agreements.
The interesting question here sort of be the difference between public opinion and what is actually law. How well informed are consumers on the topic of PFAS, in your opinion? And what is their level of concern with regard to their housewares products? And do the panelists believe that public opinion on this topic can change, or is it too late?
I'll jump in on that one. On the first part, I think that's hard to gauge without some kind of real study, because it's interesting. It's a lot of articles. There's a lot of posts, and at the same time, there's a recent survey done, and they asked how many people want nonstick cookware, and because that is the original category for this topic, and we're still seeing 3 out of every 4 people saying they want a nonstick. So how far is this? I'm not really sure. It's definitely awareness is growing. As to someone once said, every article seems now to be about water and cookware. But on the ability to change, I do believe very much. I witnessed it with PFOA when we learned, even though that's still part of this conversation, the ability of people to educate. Before that, aluminum and Alzheimer's. Before that, we have not had a decade where we were not facing an issue. Time, science, and knowledge will always win out. It will find its way. And I do believe that there are those that you can't engage or change the mind of those who are already holding their signs, but you can engage and educate those that are looking to get informed. And I do believe, and that's part of the reason we're engaging in the efforts we are doing with Tom and with Tobias. I do believe very strongly that consumers can be educated.
And may I add add to the last 2 questions? One is, it will be a question of the regulators, whether the regulators are really willing to separate the small PFAS from the fluoropolymers in the regulation. At the moment, they don't, not in the US, and we have not seen the one in Europe. As long as they are put into the same basket, it will be almost impossible. So the question was, what can we do in our supply chain? If everything is in the same basket, there's only one way. We have to move out of PFAS, of all PFAS, because if that's the direction, if ban is the direction of the regulators, we don't need to look at our supply chains. Then it is too late. With respect to the consumers, there it will be a role that everybody has to tell the story, not just CBA, not just FEC. Everybody has to do that. Get out and tell the story and have the courage. And I can tell you from my own experience, it is not always funny, because the people will say that you're defending a substance you should never defend. But we need the industry to get out and speak out.
It's interesting. It's clear by at least one of our questions, and I think the answer was earlier, but I want to raise the question anyway, because one of our attendees says a retailer is starting to challenge them on their components, that they all need to be disclosed that are in cookware. And they were given the example of stainless steel cookware, which contains iron, nickel, chromium, etc. There was some thought by this executive that since this is not intentionally added or a functional part of the product, unlike what a nonstick PFAS chemical would do, it is not needed to be listed. And please let me know your thoughts. I think you effectively answered that before, but the point here is that retailers are now engaged in this this issue in terms of being aware of what's going on, and they're going to start making decisions based on these things. So again, I think the answer is it all has to be listed. Am I correct again to reiterate that?
As
and
long as
I'm-
it's a,
Yes.
as long as it's a designated chemical. I
Yes,
mean, it
right,
has to be on one of those regulatory lists, but if it is, then yes, I think you'd be, as I said earlier, hard pressed to argue that, you know, even structural components of the product are not intentionally added.
Are we seeing retailers from whomever has to deal with them? Are they becoming more aware of this? Are you seeing them start to crack down on this a little bit?
Yes, and I think Tobias, you have some specific.
We already received letters as a company from retailers. So yes, they are moving on it. They want to be first. They want to show that they listen very carefully to the regulation. But coming back to what you just asked, there are a lot of metals in the alloy, in stainless steel alloy, and they have a purpose. And because they have a purpose, they're intentionally added to the alloy. Manganese as an example. So this is an open question because it's not clear from the regulation in the US. In Europe, it would fall under REACH. In REACH, it's clear if it's there, it has to be mentioned. In the US, I would say maybe you can hide behind it's an alloy, but coming back to what Franz said before, play it safe. If it is part of the alloy, we would strongly recommend to mention it. So manganese, phosphorus, and a lot of other things in the stainless steel, they probably have to go onto your website on January 1st, 23, and then be on the packaging on January 1st, 2024. That's at least my take from everything I read.
Will there be any grace periods for labeling after January 2024?
I'm not aware of any.
I'm
but
not aware of
maybe
any
some.
grace periods.
So, and that's an important, I think people are curious whether there's a little bit of room for, you know, getting this stuff done. These deadlines are very hard deadlines right now.
Very hard deadlines. And that goes back to the do something rather than nothing. There'll be, if you're working on it, if it's in the pipeline, if it's in progress, you have some done, and you can say to someone, listen, it's all in progress, whatever it may be. And again, this is not legal advice, but do start and do, because they will be much more cooperative if they see.
And if I would like, if I can add, on January 1st, 2023, the free or no has to go from the packaging in California. That means we have to assume that attorneys and lawyers in California will start to look for packaging that still has this statement. So any company working in California, at least from our perspective, we can only recommend make sure that you get rid of this as quickly as possible.
Stay on the issue of labeling and packaging. Who is going to be liable for updating third-party websites that sell a given company's or a given brand's products? If you're not selling direct, but they are purchasing existing product from other entities, where does that responsibility start and end in terms of the liability? I think that's the important word right now.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It comes up in the context of Prop 65 as well. So this is something that is a little more established in this world. I mean, typically, if you have a direct contractual relationship with that third-party vendor, then you usually have an obligation to notify them of whatever labeling requirements are necessary for their products. So, you know, for example, if you sell through Amazon, typically you are required to tell them what warning labels are required for your product, and they will then post the Prop 65 warning on their website. But in your agreement with them, typically any liability for the inadequacy of that warning or your failure to notify them remains with the manufacturer. And the point is, you make the product, you know what's in it, you should be telling the retailer what warning requirements are necessary.
So it all falls back to the manufacturer. And it's, what about an example of unauthorized online sellers? I mean, there's a lot out there where you're not even selling them. So
exactly. So typically in those situations where you, the manufacturer, do not have a direct contractual relationship with that third-party vendor, you do not have a responsibility to manage their website warnings. So, you know, as long as you, the manufacturer, put the warning on your product, on your website, if somebody buys that and without authorization resells That's, any violations there are not your violations.
So again, so the message really to consolidate this is do what you need to do to make sure your direct communications with the marketplace are appropriate and updated accordingly, correct?
Yep.
Yep.
Get your house in order, and then you can
Yep.
convey
Does
that.
the warning label need to go on the exterior of the package and the brochure? Will one be or the other be sufficient?
It has to be on it has to be on the label of the package, so that the consumer has to see it. And I know there's been some discussion about maybe it could be an insert in the packaging that you might not interact with until you open the product. A good way to think of it is, again, draw a corollary to Prop 65, which a lot of you have probably dealt with in the past. It has to be clear and conspicuous. You have to be able to see the label with all the information prior to the purchase. And the same is true for the website. It has to be, on the product specific page, or there has to be, some very clear way to convey the information or access the information on the product specific page.
Is there one suggested, one source or one guideline for suggested language with regard to these marking and website requirements? Does it vary from state to state? Is there one all-encompassing sort of catch-all?
If it's in regard to eliminating the word free or free from, the terminology that's often recommended is made without, so that you're saying, and it goes back to that intentionally added part. The reason for this free has not just to do with the legislation and what we've been talking about with pipeline and going all the way upstream. It's also potential for cross-contamination and shipping. So you can do all your due diligence all the way upstream on your product, your manufacturing processes, and put your product in a plastic bag that has PFAS in it. Someone goes to test it and they'll detect it.
Got it.
So if you've done all your due diligence and you believe that you have all your documentation and you can claim made without PFAS, that's the terminology to use. That they can't control cross-contamination, but at least you can prove the rest of the process. That's where a big part of that comes from, as well as the legislation aspect.
Go ahead, Tom.
Nope.
Okay, we've got several questions, so let's try to bang through a few more while we have some time here. Does Canada have any legislation on PFAS, and how is that being addressed? Anyone?
Not aware of any yet, but I'd be surprised if they weren't working on it. Have to look at
in the consumer product space, I'm not aware of any, but I'm also not a Canadian lawyer. So my understanding is they are looking at it in certain other contexts, like drinking water, groundwater, but I don't think I've seen anything in the consumer product space yet.
So Bias, any insight to that?
No, I wouldn't be surprised if they wait for the draft from Europe.
Yep. Someone asked, we converted to saying made without PFOA versus PFOA free. Is there concern saying that? I think, Fran, you've addressed that already. So is that the better way to handle that?
better way to handle it, again, as long as you've done all your homework on and ensured. It's not just a way to switch the marketing claim. You have to have also done the due diligence to make sure that you actually are, the whole process is made without intentionally added.
But Peter, just could you what was written? Made without PFOA. That's what you said.
Yes.
That's wrong. Because if you then have a PTFE, it falls under the PFAS class and you can no longer state it.
I think most of the times here in the US, Tobias, that's used in regard to sol gel or ceramic technology, the made without.
Yeah, but I just wanted to make.
Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, no, but you're right. No, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. They do say it with made with PTFE coatings, and now we can't because PTFE is a PFAS.
Yeah.
The only statement you could make, if it is true and found, is made without PFAS, but that's.
So if it is a ceramic coating, it can be stated like
Understood.
that. If it is a PTFE coating, this has to go.
there, as I think Tom said, there really aren't many safe harbors in this legislation as it's being written right now. I understand why companies are they're not looking to not follow the laws, but they're concerned about how much time they need to kind of enact all this policy and procedure. So that's important information. Someone asked about AB 1200 being vague about whether the law applies to manufacture date or retail date. I'm not sure we've addressed that. Is there any distinction? Where do we start?
So the law says you shall not sell products that do not comply with these provisions by January 1st, 2024. So it is a retail date. So and again, AB 1200 is not a ban. So you can sell products that contain any of the designated chemicals. That's fine. But you need to have a compliant label. You need to have a compliant website. So it's not a reformulation deadline. It's a labeling deadline by January 1st, 2024. But it is a sell by. You need to have all your labeling correctly done so that it's ready to go and on the shelves in January 2024.
And Tom, that's a really good point, because all that information is going to go on the website, right? So another proactive step, if you're already doing it and the website's done, start planning the packaging transition now. You'll be ahead of the schedule for 2024 when it's required on the shelves. And anybody who's proactive on it will just benefit from, in the eyes of.
Exactly. All the legwork should be done from your product analysis for the 2023 deadline. So
just plan.
Just translating that to your labels.
So the next couple of questions go back to the whole supply chain issue, and again, some liability and how to get the word out. Are there any organizations in China right now that you are aware of are helping to support and educate the factories and suppliers there? Fran?
I am not. I was just trying to think. I don't know enough about. I know they're the group GB who does the regulations. I would have to look into that. I'm not 100% sure. Tobias, do you know?
No.
Make another note of that.
No, I mean, there are test labs over there that are, testing products for certain PFAS constituents. So, this is a conversation that is happening. There are resources to do investigation for overseas manufacturers in China, but I don't know if there's a group that's doing educational outreach at this point.
And in that line, someone is talking about the only true way to identify PFAS in products may be to get chemical formulation information from the nonstick coating suppliers that has all the detail with the parts per million levels. Do you concur with that, Fran and Tobias?
Not just the nonstick, it's really everyone. It's
Okay.
If they supply you a component, check with them. And there's ways to get that. There's ways that each supplier will share their data. And then, like I mentioned, referenced before, there are these chemical chain management programs, and they can help those suppliers manage those ingredients that kind of would play their hand of the proprietary, but help report what needs to be reported, and they balance the two. So, but I want to stress again, yes, on cookware nonstick and checking with that supplier is one of the steps you take. Check with all.
And Peter, one it is a question somewhere also in the list of questions that I saw. The SP 343 that Tom mentioned was really concentrated on plastic. My reading was a little bit different of that it also is aluminum coated with PTFE. Because this needs to be checked, because if you touch the packaging anyway to get free of or no out of the packaging, you have to remove the recyclable logo from it as well. But maybe Tom, maybe my understanding of that SP 343 is wrong.
Yeah, so SP 343 specifically says you cannot claim that something is recyclable if it's made from plastic or fiber that contains PFAS that meets either the criteria, either intentionally added or above 100 ppm total organic fluorine. So the regulatory language does specifically mention plastic or fiber. So you're right, it's a little broader than just plastic, but I don't know that aluminum would fall within that.
But I will have a look again, because that would be, again, if you touch the packaging for changing something, it would be the right moment to do it. Otherwise, you have to touch it twice.
Right.
Well, once again, we've covered a lot of ground today. We got to many, many more questions than we did on our first session, and there will be many, many more questions to come. And to that point, IHA, CBA, and the European Association are going to continue to work together to provide updates on PFAS legislation and related information. We will make sure we provide resources and links to resources that may help you get answers to some of those questions, or at least direct you to people on our panel today, Tom, Fran, and Tobias, that will be able to get you answers. And if they don't have them, they'll go out and look for them. With that, I'd like to thank Fran Grossbeck, Tobias Gerfen, and Tom Lee for their insights on this important issue. Thank you all for your participation. We hope to see you at additional Connect Fall 22 sessions later today and tomorrow. See you real soon, everyone. Thanks so much.